All right. So last time we talked about the beginnings of Reconstruction, and we carried our discussion of Reconstruction forward to the point where presidential Reconstruction, which had been under Lincoln and Johnson, very lenient, very straightforward, very simple, and had allowed ex-Confederates to participate in the process, and which led to white Southerners enacting new state constitutions that had black codes and things like that, designed to limit the rights of former slaves and even recreate the conditions of slavery. We'd seen that come and go, and the radical Reconstructionists, the radical Republicans in Congress, take over Reconstruction from President Johnson. They pass the Military Reconstruction Acts, the Force Acts, and so on, and things become much more thorough. And we have the election of actual black political leaders in the South, actual black voting. So we have what W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as Black Reconstruction. But it does not last. So our task today is to understand what went wrong. How do we go from that image you saw of the first black representatives in the House of Representatives in Congress and the first black senators, like Blanche Bruce, who we looked at specifically? How do we go from that to this? This is the emblem of the Democratic Party of the state of Alabama, and might as well have been the emblem of the Democratic Party throughout the South. From this time, from about 1900, or slightly before, all the way through to the 1960s. And again, we've gone through in the last 75 years plus a great shifting in American politics when it comes to political parties. So you have to transport yourself back in time and understand, back then, this is what the Democratic Party stood for, and they didn't even make a secret about it. White supremacy for the right. We're defiant like a rooster. So let's understand how we go from one to the other. And to do that, you have to understand this narrative or story that white Southerners concoct. They will refer back to this period as the redemption. What does it mean to be redeemed, or to redeem something? To get back something that was lost. And in their telling of it, after the fact, the old South, the antebellum, meaning before the war South, was some sort of great idyllic, ideal place where everyone was happy and better off, including slaves, and that was destroyed by the war. And the war was really not even a civil war, it was a war of northern aggression. And that it was justly fought by the South against that northern aggression and oppression. That it had nothing to do with slavery. And let me pause and remind you, this is how they tell it. This is not as it really was. That it was really about, economic independence and maybe even the balance of power in Congress. Nothing to do with slavery at all, which of course it had everything to do with. But they justly and valiantly fought the Civil War, but because they were outnumbered, it was a lost cause. And this is what historians refer to this mythology that I'm laying out to you, this fake history, if you will, is the lost cause history, or the lost cause mythology. The idea that everything was great until the Union or the North came along and oppressed the South and defeated them in a war in which the South was outnumbered and had no chance. And then when that war was over, it gets worse in their telling of it. You have white people who come down from the North to try to cheat and lie and steal and make money, and they call them carpetbaggers. White Northerners who come to the South after the war to make a profit, supposedly. And to work with scalawags, which would mean white Southern loyalists, white Southerners who never supported secession, who never supported the Confederacy, People who could take the ironclad oath that we talked about last time, for example, say I was always loyal. Of course, these people would all be working under the banner of which political party? Carpetbaggers, scalawags, black people, the Republican Party at that time. And so what you see is renewed violence against these people in the form of, most especially, terrorism undertaken by the Ku Klux Klan. And yes, when Congress takes over Reconstruction, the Union Army is in charge in the South until new state governments could be formed. But the Union Army can't be everywhere in the South. It was primarily located in cities, and even then it couldn't be everywhere in the city. And so you think about, there are ample opportunities for white people in the Ku Klux Klan or other organizations, or not even organized, to do violence to either black people or other white people who support the Republican Party, to prevent them from voting primarily, or to intimidate them into not even attempting to try. And so Congress has to act on this once the radical Republicans take over from President Johnson. And one thing they do is pass the Force Acts, which I think I referred to in the last lecture. Do you remember this? What do those do? Hey, that's how I feel every day. They enable the Union Army to treat the Ku Klux Klan as if it were an enemy force. They give the Army sort of police power to go after the Klan. And that goes a long way into protecting the integrity of polling places and to allowing black people and others supporting the Republican Party to be able to vote. That's one of the things that gets, black people elected during the height of congressional Reconstruction. It also, these Force Acts allow for violations of civil rights to be tried in federal courts. What's the significance of that? Think about that. If somebody shoots or even murders someone, a white person murders a black guy trying to go and vote in Alabama, they get put on trial. The jury's a bunch of white guys. There's a real good chance back then that person's going to get off, even if it's clear that they did it. Because it's a jury of other white supremacist Alabamians. But if the federal government can charge that person with a federal crime, like violation of civil rights, even if it was you killed the guy, if you killed him, it was a hate crime because he's black and it's a violation of civil rights, you could get tried in a federal court, and that might end up different than if you're tried in the local state court. It's one of the things that the Force Acts did. Even with the Force Acts in place, though, consider what happens in Louisiana, in Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873. There in Colfax, there was an election held in which Republicans, with, of course, black support, won a number of local offices. They sort of, I don't know if they swept, but it would have been close. They won a bunch of local positions in government. Republicans do. And white supremacists in Colfax start claiming, oh, it's a fraudulent election, a voter fraud. Those votes weren't legitimate when they were. And so, in order to protect the integrity of their victory, black people armed themselves and occupied the local courthouse to say, hey, we won this election fair and square. We have our Second Amendment right to bear arms. We have the First Amendment right to assemble, and we're going to exercise those rights and protect the integrity of this election here in this courthouse. And a lot of these people, it should be pointed out, were veterans of the war, veterans of the Civil War, who had fought for the Union. Well, white people in Colfax and all throughout the surrounding areas surrounded the courthouse armed with not just rifles, but even a cannon that somebody had found somewhere. And they attacked the courthouse, killing 280 people including 50 people who had attempted to surrender and who were murdered anyway. It is a massacre, the Colfax Massacre, a white massacre of black people exercising their constitutional rights to vote, to assemble, and to bear arms. The Grant administration, when I say Grant, I mean Ulysses S. Grant, the former Union general who becomes president after the war. The Grant administration tried to prosecute these people under the Force Acts. And the court issues its decision in U.S. versus Cruikshank. This is the first of several U.S. Supreme Court case decisions in which the court basically gives its stamp of approval to white supremacy, in which it rolls back any meaningful impact that the Reconstruction Amendments 13, 14, and 15 might have had. It dilutes the value of those amendments with decision after decision. Because you have white supremacists on the Supreme Court. So what is the Cruikshank decision? 1876. Stemming from this Colfax Massacre. Well, first of all, the Supreme Court rules that the 14th Amendment only applied to state governments. Remember what the 14th Amendment said. It was after the Black Codes. It said, hey, you can't single out a group of individual citizens and say the law applies differently to them. Equal protection of the laws, right? It also says no state government can deprive an American citizen of their life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. So that's applying the Fifth Amendment to the state governments. Saying unless someone's committed a crime and been convicted or sued and lost, you can't take their life, liberty, or their stuff. Applies that to state governments. Well, in this ruling in Cruikshank, the court says it only applies to state governments. It doesn't say anything if any one individual wanted to do something violative of those things. It would only apply to other existing laws. The point is, when these people were attacked and murdered, the plaintiffs in this case, the United States, the federal government, argues that that was violating their First Amendment right to assemble, their Second Amendment right to bear arms, and their 14th Amendment rights to equal protection and due process. But the court says 14th Amendment doesn't apply because we're dealing with individual citizens, not a state government. Does that make sense? And then they argue even further that the Bill of Rights, especially here the First and Second Amendments, did not apply to the states. That the Bill of Rights specifically only applies to the federal government. So the court is saying the state doesn't necessarily have to recognize your right to assemble or to bear arms. And in effect, the court sweeps away this, any kind of accountability for this massacre at the same time that it guts the 14th Amendment and establishes this principle that, well, the Bill of Rights explicitly does not apply to state governments. It would be up to the courts to individually say if that were to be the case or not. Look at this marker, though, which at least as of last year was still there. I don't know with all that's happened in the last year if finally somebody can tear this shit down. Remember what I told you? 280 murdered, including 50 people who'd surrendered. Colfax riot, not massacre, riot. Reframes it so it looks like there was a riot and some white people only stepped in to put down the riot. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? On this site occurred the Colfax riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This April 13, 1873 marked the end of the carpetbag misrule in the South. Lost cause mythology. This is basically saying, yeah, 150 Negroes died, but it was a riot and we brought back law and order and we restored that, and that was the end of evil black carpetbagger rule. This is how they framed it. I wrote an essay about this because Trump and others keep using this law and order phrase. Not only does this come from people like the white supremacist Alabama Governor George Wallace, who like to talk about law and order as a way of suggesting to white people we're going to get tough on black people in the streets without using the words white, black, or streets or whatever. It goes back even further. When they wrote this lost cause mythology into textbooks, and I've seen these firsthand, elementary school textbooks that were still being used in the 1970s, they say, and I'm paraphrasing, but at times quoting verbatim, Black Reconstruction was a dark time when the South was ruled over by ignorant people who didn't know how to run a government, but fortunately there appeared on the streets a band of white-robed figures. The Ku Klux Klan didn't ride often, only when they had to bring back law and order. And when the Klan restored law and order and, brought justice to these bad, lawless men who were doing these terrible things, these carpetbaggers, and got these ignorant people out of government, meaning black people, then law and order were restored and there was no need for the Klan. So the history of that phrase goes back a long, long way and is tied up in this history right here and is exemplified in that marker. So let's talk about the end of Reconstruction then. So we begin during the mid-1870s and continuing on into the 1880s and 90s to see changes in the Republican Party and its priorities. This is a party that was formed by a coalition of Northern Whigs like Abraham Lincoln, who had left the Whig Party behind when it collapsed prior to the Civil War. Free Soilers who were against the expansion of slavery into the Western territories because it would negatively impact white farmers. And abolitionists. All people who were against the spread of slavery. That was what it was formed for. Well, when the war is over, and most especially when Reconstruction is sort of creeping to a close, the values and priorities of that party begin to shift towards things like industrialization. America begins to experience this, what some historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. The Republican Party slowly but surely becomes the party of big business and of industry and of corporate interests. And people's attention turned towards the West. Just prior to the Civil War, there was great interest in a transcontinental railroad and connecting California and other areas of the American West with the Midwest and Chicago and with, therefore, the rest of the country. And after the Civil War is over, accelerating that impulse is the fact that gold and silver are discovered in places like North Dakota and Nevada. And so the focus becomes Indian wars, fighting against the Sioux and the Apache and the Comanche and defeating them and forcing them onto reservations so that you can take their land and the gold and silver that is on it. That's where the attention goes. Industrialization, Indian wars. The economy, there is a panic in 1873 that brings about a long economic depression. I mean, you could call it for sure a recession, if not a depression, an economic downturn. That takes a lot of attention during the late 1870s. The point being, people's attention pivots away from Reconstruction and enforcing it in the South. A lot of the old stalwarts of radical republicanism like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens died and are gone. And you don't have them in Congress advocating for the rights of former slaves. So you begin to see things like the Freedmen's Bureau is allowed to expire. It comes up before Congress, it's not renewed. It ceases to be. Along with the, during the economic recession, there's a Freedmen's Savings and Loan, a bank which a lot of former slaves had put their money in, what little money they had. Well, it failed and there's no bailout. And thousands of former slaves lose everything with no help from the government. That same year, the Supreme Court ruled in another case, this one the slaughterhouse cases, that dealt with, as the styling of the cases we would say, the name would suggest, slaughterhouses down in New Orleans, if I remember correctly, but for our purposes deals again with the 14th Amendment. The court in the slaughterhouse cases holds that the 14th Amendment applies only to national citizenship. That is, when the 14th Amendment, when Congress says everyone has the same privileges and immunities of citizenship, they only mean of the nation, not of the state of Louisiana or the state of Alabama. Again, this is limiting the scope of the 14th Amendment and the meaning and impact that it might have. What this means is that further undermines civil rights protections for blacks in the South. Now, Congress tries to counter that by passing another Civil Rights Act. This one, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, in it, Congress declares that all citizens enjoy equal access to public accommodations. When I say public accommodations, I mean things like hotels, restaurants, public transportation, which would have at that time been trains and streetcars and that kind of thing. Any public space could be characterized as a public accommodation, and Congress attempts to say you can't deny access to those public accommodations on the basis of race or whatever. If you're a citizen, you're a citizen. Equal access. That was 1875. The Supreme Court invalidates that in the civil rights cases. 1883 decision. In the civil rights cases decision, the Supreme Court declares that Congress could not do anything about the discriminatory actions of individuals or private groups, only state governments. So they're saying if we're looking at the 14th Amendment, that only applies to state governments in this regard. So if a state wanted to say, we're going to segregate our streetcars or whatever, that would be one thing. But if it's a private company, they're saying government can't do anything about it. Private company runs a streetcar business and wants to segregate, that's perfectly fine. If some individual doesn't want black people in their store or restaurant or hotel, then that's fine. That makes sense? And I mean, just look at the court. Look at the justices. A bunch of old white guys. Then there's the Compromise of 1877, which represents, I guess, more or less the end of Reconstruction. There was a presidential election that year, and that some of the electoral returns were disputed. A similar thing happened probably just before you all were born in the election between George W. Bush and Al Gore in 2000, that there were some ballots. This is when we had paper ballots, and some of the ballots from Florida, like there was something wrong with some of them, and there was a doubt as to whether they had been properly counted. And one side called for a recount, and the Supreme Court stepped in and said no recount, and so George Bush won the state of Florida, which gave him the election outright to the presidency. Similar thing here, except it was the state of Ohio's returns, but whoever won the state, similar to Bush v. Gore, was going to win the election. Only this one was decided in the House of Representatives. Just procedurally, it happened that way. The House of Representatives was going to vote on this issue, and however they voted was going to be the way the election was going to go. And so the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, goes to some Democrats in the South and says, look, white people, anybody who was a Democrat in the South at that time would have been white. Look, if you vote for me on this and I become president, even though I'm not in your party, I promise you the first thing I will do is to pull the Union Army out of the South and end Reconstruction. And that's what happens. Hayes wins the election by cutting this deal with white Southern Democrats, and in return for their support, he then again, more or less ends Reconstruction by pulling any remaining Union Army elements out of the South. So any effect that the Force Acts would have had is gone. What happens over the course of the next 25 years or so is that bit by bit, through violence and intimidation, stuffing of ballot boxes and various other means of voting fraud, Democrats, white Southern Democrats, win control of state legislatures, state governorships, and all other positions in state government all throughout the South. And when they do, they take the constitutions that they had created during Congressional Reconstruction and tear them up and throw them away and come up with new state constitutions. They couldn't go so far as to have black codes in them as they had done immediately after the war during presidential Reconstruction, because that would be too blatant to just say, yeah, black people can't vote and do this and that and the other. But they have to be more crafty, in other words. And so they come up with new state constitutions, which, make no mistake, are 100% designed to support white supremacy, including the still operative Constitution of the state of Alabama, which was enacted in 1901. They have Jim Crow laws in them, and they have devices in them that would create disenfranchisement of black people. So Jim Crow laws are more specific than black codes, which dealt with a range of things. What did Jim Crow laws do, in a word? Segregation. Jim Crow laws established segregation in all public accommodations. And you say, well, that doesn't fall in line with the civil rights cases decision. Yeah, well, there's going to be another Supreme Court decision we're going to talk about in just a second that upholds these Jim Crow laws. And then disenfranchisement. So the franchise is a word that used to be used to refer to your right to vote. The franchise is your right to vote. So if you are enfranchised, as would say the passage of the 15th Amendment, if you're a black man, that means you're given the right to vote, right? So if you are disenfranchised, that means that right is taken away from you. But again, it can't be done in such a blatantly obvious way as to say, yeah, well, black men can't vote after all. Clear violation of the 15th Amendment, so you got to be more crafty. What are the devices that they use to make sure that black men can't vote? So what could you do if you consider, like, okay, former slaves are pretty poor. Remember, they never got land, and so they're sharecroppers, tenant farmers. They're pretty poor. So what could you do to make sure they can't vote?
Money.
Yeah, make them pay money. So a poll tax. The polls are where you go to vote, right? The polling place. So if you require someone to go there and then have to pay a tax to be able to vote,
they're not going to be able to vote.
They're not going to be able to do it because they don't have any money, right? Poll taxes. Okay, 2, during slavery, deliberately slaves were kept illiterate, most of them. Not everybody is Frederick Douglass and was able to educate themselves. So what else could you require to vote that would mean that black people couldn't do it? Literacy test. People come in and want to vote, okay, or you want to register to vote? Here's the U.S. Constitution. I want you to find Article 3, Section 5, and read that and interpret that for me. Well, I'm illiterate. Okay, well, you can't register to vote. That makes sense? There's a complication, though. There are a lot of white people in the South who are both illiterate and poor. But you want them to vote. Maybe. You certainly would rather they voted than black people. So what can you do to make sure that they can vote and the black people can't? Grandfather clause. You ever heard of this? So they pass laws that say, okay, here it is, 1880, whatever. If your grandfather was a registered voter, you're not subject to these new requirements. You're grandfathered in and you're already automatically a registered voter. What's the significance of somebody's grandfather at that moment? So if you were white, there's a decent chance your grandfather was a registered voter, right? If you're black, your grandfather was a slave and therefore definitely not a registered voter, right? So this is what they do. They put things into law that don't have to say black people, white people, this and that. They get more crafty about it, but they are absolutely every bit of this designed to establish white supremacy and take all voting rights and other rights away from black people. Does that make sense? All right, well. Talk about Jim Crow laws specifically. Where does that name come from? A tradition develops, actually in the north, it makes its way south, that we know as minstrelsy. Minstrelsy would be white performers dressing up in blackface, painting their faces black, and then acting out skits or bits that would make fun of like the most egregious stereotypes of black people. Like they'd have a character that was just hopelessly ignorant, right? Or hapless. Or just sort of all shucks and happy-go-lucky, but, you know, kind of dumb. All the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes that white people had of black people played out on the stage in the form of these blackface characters being acted out by white men. And one of the popular characters had the name of Jim Crow. And so that is where the name is sort of plucked from. So even the name harkens back to racism. Just out and out blatant racism. With the segregation of all public accommodations by way of these Jim Crow laws, you immediately see pushback, particularly in regards to streetcars. The streetcars were the public transportation in cities. You know, buses like that ran though on an electrical line that would, you know, taxi people from one part of the city to the other. You guys been to downtown Atlanta in the last several years? There's a streetcar down there. They didn't create a dedicated lane for it though, so it's just kind of like in the way all the time and nobody uses it. Which kind of sucks because the idea was they were going to connect the Centennial Park area with the Martin Luther King Center area, and it just clunkily done. Anyway, back then it wasn't a novelty. Streetcars were public transportation, right? And they're segregated. So a guy in New Orleans, a shoemaker named Homer Plessy, who was, by the way, 7/8 white, only 1/8 black, but in the thinking of the day, that just made him black, challenged the Louisiana Separate Car Act, which was a Jim Crow law. He challenges it by engaging in an act of civil disobedience. Anybody know what that means? Civil disobedience. Disobedience means breaking the law in this case, on purpose. Civil disobedience means purposely breaking a law that you feel like is unjust or immoral or unconstitutional in order to raise awareness of that injustice, of that immorality, of that unconstitutionality. I think I saw literally no one write that down or type that definition of civil disobedience, so I will try again. Civil disobedience is the act of purposely breaking a law that you feel like is unjust, immoral, unconstitutional, purposely breaking the law, you feel like it's unjust, immoral, unconstitutional. Doing that in order to raise awareness of that injustice, of that immorality, of that unconstitutionality. Purposely breaking a law you think is unjust, immoral, unconstitutional, specifically in order to raise awareness of that injustice, etc. So when Homer Plessy gets on the streetcar down in Louisiana, he's deliberately breaking the Louisiana Separate Car Act Jim Crow law, knowing that this will go to court and that hopefully maybe he can win the court case. Maybe the newspapers will cover it so he can raise awareness of what he feels like is an injustice and an unconstitutional law. Consider, if you have a state government passing a law that says you citizens, i.e. black people, cannot ride this same streetcar. Isn't that a violation of the equal protection established in the 14th Amendment that says you can't single out one group of citizens and say the law applies differently to them? So he brings a civil case, he sues the state. He was, of course, arrested. I mean, that's what happens when you engage in civil disobedience. You get arrested. And his case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court says, no, segregation is fine in public accommodations, even if it's through the actions of the state, in this case, the state of Louisiana, as long as you have separate but equal. As long as the facilities for black people and white people are equal, you can have separate facilities. Does that make sense? Separate but equal is the principle established by the Plessy ruling. In other words, the Supreme Court in Plessy puts its stamp of approval on Jim Crow. Even through the actions of state governments, it was okay to segregate. This decision holds until the 1950s. This decision holds until almost a decade after World War II, where you have the beginnings of what we'll call in this class the classical phase of the civil rights movement. This becomes the standard. Never mind that the entire purpose of segregation in this regard was white supremacy. The court ignores that. And the court ignores the absolute fact that the facilities, they were never equal. And they never would be. Much later, the court would reverse this decision and acknowledge that, but not now. So we have the era of segregation, an era in which black parents will have to condition their children and raise them up to understand how to follow the etiquette of segregation, the rituals of segregation, designed to humiliate them in day-to-day ways, to condition them on the etiquette of white supremacy, to practice what we call deference. Never look a white person in the eye. Always call them sir or ma'am. Move to the side if they're coming down the sidewalk. Never challenge Jim Crow segregation. Avoid anything that might bring about a violent reaction from white people or an otherwise negative action. That's what parents have to teach their children growing up. And then there's disenfranchisement. I've already talked about the poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clauses. In addition to that, there's violence and intimidation ongoing. Anywhere you have black people trying to exercise their right to vote, there is violence during this period. In addition to that, there's all manner of what you might call chicanery. By this I mean like foolishness, just outright absurdity. For example, White officials could move a polling place to some location only known to white people if black people start coming trying to vote. Or move the registration office. They could just stuff the ballot boxes. You have a white person, an elected official locally that's trying to count votes for like the mayor or county commissioner, and you get a bunch of black votes coming in. You could just stuff a bunch of fake white votes in there and be like, oh, candidate white so-and-so won. I mean, just outright voter fraud. What else? You could have, you could just not count the black votes too, of course. You could have, black people coming to try to register, and you could just literally flip the sign around and say, sorry, this office is closed for the day, and then only open it up when white people come. So you don't even have to pass laws. You can just do whatever the hell you want. I mean, you're the ones in power. So, additionally, the Democratic Party it moves at one point to become a private club, if you will, to say you have to, in order to vote in a Democratic primary, you have to be a member of the Democratic Party. And then, of course, you could refuse party membership to black people. And by 1900, the Republican Party was completely powerless in the South. And so the only election that mattered was the Democratic primary. The South becomes like a one-party state. There is no opposition party. And if you can't vote in the primary because you're black and can't be a member of the party, then your vote doesn't mean anything. The establishment of the so-called white primary. All that makes sense? And then all I mean by new laws is what we talked about earlier. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. Well, the result is a staggering reduction in black voting and black registration, and a complete reduction of black representation in elected offices. A 100% reversal of the gains made during Black Reconstruction. So how do white people back this up ideologically? And they do try. I'm already sensing, and I should have known when I went and was reviewing my notes last night from last year, I see like stopped here, and it's like, oh, there's still like 2 pages of lecture left. Like I should have known this was going to be a 2-parter, even though it's already part 2 of Reconstruction. So what I'll just do is sit down in my office at some point between now and the end of the weekend and just record myself finishing the lecture, and you'll have that before the quiz. So, white people throughout the Western world, not just in the American South, I mean in the American North, in Great Britain and France, I mean all over the Western world, many of them believed in white supremacy. You guys know who Darwin is, I hope. Charles Darwin, who has described to us the process of evolution, right? Of species and the process of natural selection. Well, a man named Herbert Spencer takes Darwin's concepts of evolution and natural selection and then attempts to apply them to human civilization and human history, and argues that throughout the history of human civilization, what you have seen is the, quote, survival of the fittest. The best of human races, according to Spencer, in other words, has risen to the top in our world. And at that moment, at the culmination of the Industrial Revolution, where the countries of Western Europe and the United States have industrialized and the rest of the world has not, and they have steamships and armies with machine guns, and they've mastered or begun to master the use of chemicals, and they have automobiles and so on. it might look to you like that represents a superior civilization and therefore a superior race. So social Darwinism means believing that the most technologically advanced society is that of a superior race, i.e. white people. Social Darwinism in this case is a way to justify, in other words, racism. Furthermore, that then justifies imperialism and the idea that, at this moment in world history, nations like America, which is a little bit late to the game, but Britain and France, they have conquered or colonized, if you will, Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia and parts of China. America establishes relative dominance through its corporations over parts of Latin America, specifically Central America and Cuba and various islands in the Pacific, and exploits those people for resources so that they can further industrialize. Imperialism, that is establishing an empire by exploiting other people economically through sheer force. The rationale behind that becomes what one English poet called the white man's burden. That is, the idea that we white people are more advanced than people in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and so it's our duty or burden to spread our advancements and our technology to those people. But what does that really look like when the Belgians take over the Congo in Africa, or the French take over Southwest Africa, or the British colonize South Africa and India, or the French in Vietnam, or the United States through its fruit companies in Guatemala and Honduras and so on? They build railroads and telegraph lines and radio towers to benefit themselves and their companies, not the local people who get displaced off their land, forced to work for these companies for pitiful wages, and they get exploited in the process. With the excuse being, oh, it's the white man's burden. We're the more advanced race. We're going to spread our technology and our advancements to all the rest of the world. All of this was happening at the same time, and it represents a pervasive or uniform scientific racism. And by scientific, I mean pseudo-scientific, not actual science. You had anthropologists, sociologists who claimed to have scientific proof of a hierarchy of racism, meaning they claimed that scientifically they could prove that white people are a superior race. Despite the fact that we know race is a social construct. There's nothing scientific about race at all. The point is that this allowed white supremacists in the South to justify Jim Crow as a way of saying it's the natural way of things, right? It's the scientific order of the world. And then also, too, to begin to construct this narrative that white men are these brutish, over-sexualized beings that are always trying to rape white women, which is ironic considering that during slavery, literally the opposite was routinely true, in which you had white men raping black women. But during the era of Jim Crow, you have white lawmakers that obsess with this notion that black men are out to have sex with white women, and that's going to bring about miscegenation, a word that would mean white women being raped by black men and then having mixed race children that would then dilute the purity of the white race. That they would, the word they like to use is they would mongrelize the white race, these black men, by impregnating white women. And that this would lead eventually to the demise of Western civilization. If this sounds like lunatic fringe stuff, I study in particular the 60s and 70s and beyond, and I can promise you there are people in positions of power who are writing this shit in, like, for public consumption. Elected officials that are putting this shit out there in the 60s and 70s. It's not fringe. It's not far-fetched. People actually believed and said these things. And they adopt the one drop rule. Remember what I said about Homer Plessy? 7/8 white, doesn't matter. One drop of black blood meant he was a mongrel and he was therefore black. There's no nuanced categories like you saw back in Spanish Latin America, where they went to great lengths to categorize, okay, you have X amount of Native American ancestry versus actual peninsular Spanish ancestry versus people who are of Spanish descent born in this country, and so on and so on. No. Any amount of black, quote unquote, blood meant that you were a black person. Well, needless to say, given all of this, a lot of black people elect to leave the South during this period and settle elsewhere. In fact, a lot of black folks have been doing so since even during the war. They discover that racism is a national issue in America and not just a Southern one. During the Civil War, more than 100,000 black people left the South for good. A lot of them end up in the Northeast. Some of them end up in the Midwest, around Chicago and throughout Ohio or Indiana or Kansas. Some of them end up further west, as far out as California. Some of them go out there by way of the U.S. Army. The U.S. Colored Troops was disbanded at the end of the Civil War, but new units were organized of black troops. And they're sent out west to fight the Indian Wars. Remember what I said, when gold and silver are discovered in the West, the United States breaks its treaties with, for example, the Sioux, the Apache, the Comanche, and they go to war with them so they can take their lands. The 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry, they all go west, and where you did have black soldiers, it's the same as with the Civil War, they had white officers. But the Indians adopt the name for these black soldiers, buffalo soldiers, they call them, because they fought with such ability and strength, and because Native Americans were enamored with their hair. They call the Indians give the black soldiers the name buffalo soldiers. The military assumed that by sending these black troops out west, there'd be less hostility, less racism or whatever. It's not true. It's not always the case. They faced discrimination. There was always that tendency to put them to work laboring first and in combat only when they had to. But it's the same as with the Civil War, and we looked at the 54th Massachusetts. When they fight with gallantry and ability, to the point that 13 enlisted men and 6 officers received the Medal of Honor for their roles in the Indian Wars of the late 1800s. So some black folks who left the South left the West for land, utilizing the Homestead Act. Congress passes the Homestead Act to encourage Western migration. It provided 160 acres for anyone who would commit to living on and farming that land for a period of 5 years. So if you will move out to the West and you will commit to, I will live on this land and farm it productively for 5 years, 160 acres is yours. Hell of a deal. And one that many black families took up. A lot of these black migrants would settle in all black towns, especially in Kansas and Oklahoma. Coming from places like Kentucky and Tennessee and Mississippi, Texas and Missouri. Settling in all black towns in Kansas and Oklahoma, these people become known as the exodusters. It's a play on words, like Exodus from the Bible means, leaving, migrating out, or in that case being Well, the idea that black people had always had, that equating themselves with the Jews and being in a period of captivity, but being delivered from that into a promised land, being led out of captivity in an exodus. So they're known as the exodusters because it's dusty out in the west, right? They established more than 60 black towns out there in Kansas and Oklahoma, and were able to realize that which they could never realize in the South, which is the dream, the American dream, if you will, of land ownership and of having a farm to till and to call your own, and having a crop that was all your own, as opposed to living as tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Questions about any of that? Well, some black folks in the South left for the North, as I mentioned earlier. Were they mostly settled in cities looking for wage work? As I've alluded to before, America was industrializing at a rapid pace. Factories are popping up everywhere. They are powered by electricity now. You no longer had to rely on steam power, so you could put factories anywhere, including in the dead middle of cities, where you could have thousands of people who could come and work wage-earning jobs in these factories with very little skill whatsoever, other than running certain machines. Mechanization, in other words. And along with that, you have the growth of America's railroad network and the growth of the telegraph, which enabled rapid transportation and communication. The rise of corporations and the advent of a stock market. Advancements in the production of steel and the refining of crude oil. All these are elements of the second industrial revolution. Now, a lot of black folks who migrated to cities from Chicago to Detroit to New York and Philadelphia and on up to Boston, they find jobs, but they also find that the conditions are poor for black and white workers. The wages are poor, and there are almost no legal protections for the rights of workers. In fact, this is the period where workers were only just beginning to attempt to organize themselves into labor unions. And a lot of the early successful labor unions were hostile to black membership. The Knights of Labor was one of just a few major labor unions that was welcoming to all workers, as was the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. These were two examples of labor unions who would allow black people to be members and would not discriminate. Unfortunately, and especially in the case of the IWW, and partly because they're welcoming to all workers regardless of race, gender, or whether they're immigrants, and I mean to say the other major labor unions were hostile to black people, immigrants, women. And the ones that are not are considered radical. And they get painted as these radical, like anarchist or socialist institutions that are like a threat to American democracy, which is not true. Yes, there were a few notable incidents of violence perpetrated by anarchists during this period, but people use those as excuses to paint these organizations as, violent and reactionary and radical when they really probably were not. And it's another example of white politicians using racism and using fear to keep poor black and white workers from working together. And ultimately, what might have been the start of true interracial cooperation within labor, that is organized workers, it never comes to be. And the one labor union that emerges from this period into the early 20th century as the most successful national union is the one that was discriminatory and not open to black participation. Questions about any of that? Well, I could go on for another 5 minutes, but I mean, if I'm definitely going to have a supplement to end this, because we got a few more slides, looking at segregation in the north and disenfranchisement in the north and in the west, and then we have another spotlight feature on Ida Wells. Anybody ever heard of Ida Wells? I had when I taught this last year, I gave my lecture and my spotlight on Ida Wells, and somebody raised their hand and said, "Why don't we learn about this in school?" Like, that's why you're here. That's why we have this class. So we'll talk about her, or I will rather, in a supplementary lecture video from the desk, and make sure that I get that posted as soon as possible so that you're ready when we come back for quiz 1. And when did I say that would be? Thursday, because yeah, we have a film on Ida Wells on Tuesday, right? Okay.